Resumed, I call Aidan Burley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Weir. It's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon, and I'd also like to start by thanking the Minister for turning up. Our last encounter in an adjournment debate was on the rather more controversial issue of trades union reform, and I can assure the Minister that whilst this afternoon may be slightly less spicy, it will nevertheless be just as important as a subject for this debate. Mr. Weir, I was prompted to apply for this debate this afternoon after recently attending the opening of a new IT recycling facility within my constituency, which is called PRM Green Technologies. And as a declaration of interest, Mr. Weir, I'm delighted to say that several of their directors have travelled down from Cannock to Westminster to be here for this debate this afternoon. So I'm delighted to see Richard Manning, Paul Mullett and Tim Hawkins sat in the gallery over there. And no doubt if I get any of the IT detail wrong, they will intervene on me from a sedentary position. Or perhaps not. But what I learned from my recent visit was very interesting. Here was a local firm exhibiting strong and sustained growth, providing much needed jobs for local people, and in fact especially recruiting from the disadvantaged and long-term unemployed. Yet they would appear to be deliberately operating at a competitive disadvantage, because it has long been their industry's standard to charge end users and organisations, including public bodies such as schools and hospitals, to dispose of all of their old, unwanted and end-of-life IT equipment. But yet PRM offer this service for free, whilst remaining a profitable business. That is to say, Mr. Weir, that whenever an organisation has finished using its IT equipment, whether that's computers or laptops or other hardware, and it wants to get rid of them securely, which is an important issue I will come on to in a minute, the accepted practice is to pay a firm to come and collect the equipment and take it away. And there are sensible reasons for doing so, because you're not just paying to have the items collected, like you might have household waste collected, but you're actually paying for a service whereby the data left on them will be wiped and they will be securely recycled. And this is especially important if there is sensitive material on there, as such might be the case if the computer had been used in a hospital to store medical files, or by the police for criminal records, or with vulnerable children in a school or a care home. The last thing we want is for British police computer data to end up for sale on second-hand computers in Iraq, as has happened recently. But yet, here is PRM Green Technologies from Cannock, offering all of these services, the collection, the secure recycling, the data wiping, for free, and doing so at a national level. Their business model does not charge the service user a single penny to recycle their redundant and end-of-life or damaged IT equipment. And as I learned from my visit, they already have over 4,000 customers who already enjoy a completely 100% free charge of service. So why is all this important, Mr. Weir, and why this debate today? Well, my simple question this afternoon is this. If this service is available for free to national agreed standards of data cleansing, then why should any organisation, be it public or private, pay for the same service? Because if you think about it, this has the potential to be incredibly important for the public sector as a whole, who we know are already struggling to deal with budget reductions in this age of austerity. Because if a school spends money on paying to have its old IT equipment recycled, that is money that cannot then be spent on teachers or sports facilities or a new playground. If an NHS trust spends money on paying to have its old IT equipment recycled, that is money that can't then be spent on doctors and nurses or medicine. And if a council spends money on paying to have its old IT equipment recycled, that is money which can't then be spent on libraries or leisure facilities or on resurfacing roads, services that we know all of our constituents rely on and prioritise. To take just one example, Mr. Weir, many of PRM's customers are education providers, such as schools, colleges and universities. And the firm calculates that they alone have saved the education sector in excess of £5 million. And that is the same amount of money which could have employed a total of 237 teachers. Just imagine what that could mean if that was rolled out nationally. If a small company from Cannock with 28 employees, can in effect pay the salaries of 237 teachers, how many more teachers could be provided nationally if schools' budgets were better directed? This one firm also has 17 local authorities on its books, as well as 3 NHS healthcare trusts. So again, think of how many council staff or medical professionals could be employed if all of the other local authorities in the United Kingdom and all of the other healthcare trusts did not waste their budgets on paying to have their old IT equipment recycled. So my first question to the Minister this afternoon is, what can the government do to make public bodies aware that there are firms, not just PRM in my constituency, but others too, who will absorb all of the costs of recycling their old IT equipment? And my second question to the Minister is, what can we do to ensure public bodies do not waste their budgets on IT recycling and instead ensure every penny is spent on the front line? And my third question to him is, will he start with his own department and write to me and tell us whether the Cabinet Office spends any of its department's budget on getting rid of its old computers? And will his department write to the other Whitehall departments asking similar questions? Because if this many organisations, bodies and individuals can see the benefit of not only using this company once, but continuing to use them time and again, why aren't there more sections of society, industry and government waking up to the fact that during these austere times, there are companies run by individuals such as those in the gallery today who will charge nothing, and in doing so can and will make a difference to their organisation's ability to serve the public. But I do think we need to go slightly further. We must ask ourselves what challenges, real or perceived, lie in the way of government departments or larger parts of the civil service availing themselves of such a service provision for no cost whatsoever, and therefore providing far greater value for money for the taxpayer in general. And the biggest issue after talking to PRM at my visit that faces government assets would appear to be security. Fears over data being lost, assets going untracked, and personnel entering sites without correct checks in place all present great concerns, and that is feedback that they have received as a business. And people might ask, are companies that perform this service for free actually capable of providing the level of data security required and yet still maintain zero costs? Well, to do so, all their staff would need to be vetted to BS 7858 standards. Their premises would need to be protected by several layers of physical security, including 2 external rings of steel, 24-hour security guards, CCTV monitored 24 hours a day, monitored alarm systems, internal access control, and interior steel cages which are protected 24 hours a day. All of this security is needed to ensure that the data remains secure once it has been collected from an organisation and before it is deleted and wiped. They would need to destroy data assets using government-approved software and devices, as well as special shredding techniques. And their vehicles would need to be fully liveried, satellite tracked, and have CCTV on board to further protect the assets they carry on behalf of their service users. Surely, Mr. Weir, they cannot do all this without charging the customer. Well, the simple answer is they can, and they do. PRM does this, and other companies around the country do this too. There is quite simply no catch. And if they can do this, then concerns over data security need not be valid concerns and need not be a reason to continue with existing paid-for IT collection contracts. And how does PRM manage to offer such a service? Because they manage to extract every little bit of residual value from every kilogram of every item they collect and process. And because they've chosen to model their business in this way, they ensure that they extract maximum value and therefore guarantee minimum waste and landfill. Because if you think about it for a second, if you have to absorb your own collection costs, not least the petrol and the vans, yet alone the infrastructure that I've just described, you make absolutely sure you extract every bit of residual value from every kilogram of every item of IT equipment you collect, because you have to. But here's the depressing bit for the Minister. While companies like PRM Green Technologies can offer this service, they increasingly see the government departments and the NHS that they talk to unable to respond to their unique offer. Their initial contacts are often to talk directly with the responsible IT department or the finance department, but more often than not, they find that current contracts blanket cover all aspects of a service, otherwise known as the dreaded outsourcing or facilities management. By way of a total tangent, these are the same sort of inclusive outsourced contracts which led to the TV chef James Martin to discover that Welsh hospitals could not buy Welsh lamb to serve to their patients because their outsourced contractor bought all their lamb from New Zealand, even though there were lambs grazing on the fields outside the Welsh hospital and local Welsh farmers could charge almost 50% less than the New Zealand imports. I digress, Mr. Weir, and perhaps that is a debate for another time, but the point remains valid. Even if the department wanted to be involved, they are often tied into a cost-making exercise. And when discussing this with senior people in a government department, for example, buyers in our councils, they are often surprised that this free service even exists. And what should be most shocking of all to the Minister is that often their tendering model cannot cope with assessing tenders that have a negative or zero value in the calculation. Think about that for a second. Because the councils cannot conceive of not paying for this service, the computer literally says no. Now, if that is the case, and it is, then we must examine the charges that are incurred across every part of government and question the structure of these contracts. These charges appear to be formed as part of much larger and more complex contracts of service provision, which we need to investigate in order to render them more transparent for the public good. So my next question to the Minister is this. What can be done to ensure better procurement of goods and services across the public sector, which allows schools and hospitals and police forces and councils to avail themselves of a free IT recycling service? Maybe, Mr. Weir, as a society, we need to rethink our own negative attitudes to people who offer something for nothing. In this instance, that isn't the case, because as I have already explained, there is always residual value in IT equipment, which all providers need in order to ensure their commercial model is viable. In short, even companies which get paid to collect the unwanted computer equipment still need to be able to sell them on, still need to be able to break them down for parts in order to be a viable, profitable business. The difference is some companies, such as PRM here today, have the social conscience not to skim extra cream off the top. And all these organisations really need to know, whether it's police forces, councils, hospitals, or even businesses, all they need to know is one thing. Where are their assets going to end up? But if you think about it, it makes more business sense for these IT recycling providers to ensure they can extract maximum value from these assets without charge to the end service user. If you only get paid for what you can repair and refurbish and resell or recycle in full, then it can't be in their interest to dump or dispose of any of these items incorrectly, as simply they won't get a penny for any of them which are dealt with in such a manner. With asset tracking and reporting systems in place, the customer can be further reassured of their good intentions. And besides which, if you think about it, there is no inherent greater security for a firm who charges to pick up your IT equipment and then recycles it and sells it on, to a firm who picks it up for free and then recycles it and sells it on. And in fact, the reverse might be true, because if you're making a margin on picking up the goods, you arguably have less incentive to securely recycle those goods and squeeze every penny out of them, as frankly you've already got some cash in the bank simply from collecting the items. A final and perhaps the greatest problem presents itself when the very people tasked with ensuring their assets are disposed of correctly are often poorly equipped, through no fault of their own, to make an informed decision about how to deal with that problem. An example of this, Mr. Weir, would be a primary school whose entire IT assets and support are largely dealt with by the head teacher, who receives very little direction in how to approach the challenges of safe and correct disposal of IT equipment, and how to do so whilst ensuring value for money for their school. To that head teacher, paying for this service might seem a sensible and industry-accepted practice, not least because they might never have heard of the alternatives that could mean that they could actually pay for that classroom extension, or that playground, or even a new computer room. Now, I don't know how to change all these perceptions, but I do know that the Minister, also wearing his other hat, has responsibility for communicating the not entirely straightforward concept of the big society. So maybe in his response he could draw on his communications experience and the power and the leverage and the tentacles of his department as to how we can go about changing these people's perceptions. Because once the benefits are fully realised, then many further positives can flow, with public money being better directed to the front line rather than wasted in unnecessary ways. And even though the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive, which is the European Community Directive on waste electrical and electronic equipment, which requires all of our electrical items to be registered and recycled safely, has placed the onus of the cost of recycling on the producers and importers of these items, this has not appeared to filter down to many of the organisations previously mentioned. Despite computer companies having to adopt membership of approved appliance schemes and have to pay to offset the large tonnages of equipment they place on the market every single year, there are still just as many companies in existence who still charge for the service that they provide. In conclusion, Mr. Weir, every electrical item has some degree of residual value, and with modern recycling techniques, there is no reason why this value should not be returned in some measure. If a service provider, such as PRM, is willing to speculate that the residual value in any goods collected are going to be greater than the overall costs of collecting and processing them, then surely that must be to everybody's advantage. And there is a moral case, surely, for public sector organisations to spend as many pennies as possible on their front line, rather than paying for redundant IT equipment to be taken away and disposed of. And there is a financial case to spend more money on teachers and nurses and doctors and policemen and less on IT waste recycling. But how do we make the decision makers in these organisations more accessible to the providers of these services for free? How do we make them more aware of the alternative, cheaper options that exist? Should indeed we compel them, by law if necessary, to use free providers rather than being allowed to pay for the equivalent service? What can we do about the outsource contracts I talked about, which tie big organisations like NHS trusts into schemes they simply cannot opt out of, even when they see a better alternative? And ultimately, what can the government do to help the public sector to help itself when it comes to bearing the costs of recycling old IT equipment? These are the questions for the Minister, who has a huge opportunity now to make massive savings across the public sector at no cost to jobs by ensuring that no one spends a single penny to recycle their redundant and end-of-life or damaged IT equipment, and instead uses firms like PRM Green Technologies, who are a great example of a private sector firm acting in the best interests of the public sector, taxpayers, and society as a whole.